Good afternoon. So normally when I would begin teaching an electric vehicle class, I would go around the class and ask everybody their thoughts on electrical vehicles. It becomes somewhat of a polarizing discussion, often political discussion. In the interest of time, we'll save that stuff for the end. Hopefully it doesn't get too politically charged, but I like to start out with a basic history of where electric vehicles came from, how we arrived at the place we are today. So these go back over 100 years. 1894 started Henry Morris and Pedro Salam started to retrofit carriages. You know, at that point, we were still dealing with horse-drawn carriages and all of the issues that come with that in a populous area. And so they started to build some electric vehicles. Of course, at that time, they didn't have battery technologies that we currently have, so they were very heavy. They had steel wheels to start with, so the ride was probably not what we would expect in a vehicle today. Eventually, they built about 12 of them and created the first public transportation system in New York with electric vehicles. But they had a whopping range of 25 miles and a top speed of 20. So in today's world, obviously that would not fly. Fast forward a few years, and a company in Detroit, the Anderson Carriage Company, started producing electric vehicles as well, and proceeded to, or continued to create these for the next 30 years, totaling about 13,000 units. Oddly enough, Clara Ford, the wife of Henry Ford, who we could argue was the father of the current internal combustion engine, modern automobile, she drove an electric vehicle around Detroit for years. Now you might ask yourself why. Well, they were primarily selling these vehicles to women and to physicians because of the reliability. An electric vehicle was going to go. Whereas a gasoline engine, you would have to crank it to get it to start, and they were, pretty problematic back in that day. So just kind of interesting. Fast forward about 50 years, and electric vehicles had taken, this great hiatus, and we'll get more to that in a minute. But Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company, retrofitted a Mercury Lynx. Now this was a small economy vehicle. And they started playing around with implementing or retrofitting electric motors into the vehicles using lead acid batteries. And sorry, we've got pop-ups going on here. A couple years later, they took the Ford Aerostar van, did the same thing with it, slightly bigger battery and slightly bigger battery capacity. But, again, wasn't practical for mass production. This was one I ran into as a technician. I was working at a small shop off of North Main shortly after I finished Rock Valley's program. And Atwood Mobile Products, the owner of Atwood, Seth Atwood, had developed this electric car. And it was kind of a strange looking thing. He had two gasoline versions of the same car designed to be a three-wheeled vehicle, very economical, very aerodynamic. And, but a local company developing an electric vehicle back in the mid-'80s. This is what the back of the vehicle looked like. So my job as a technician at that particular shop was kind of to decommission this vehicle. They were going to put it in storage, and it still had all of the live batteries in it. And so I counted 15 lead acid batteries. When you think about what a car battery weighs, if we average about 50 pounds of battery, you're talking about an additional 750 pounds of weight in the back of this vehicle. And it actually affected this particular one to the point where they had to install dual rear wheels on each side. So this one became a 5-wheel vehicle instead of a 3-wheel vehicle. Then we fast forward a little bit further into the 90s. General Motors came out with a vehicle known as the EV1. This was the first mass-produced electric vehicle made available to the public. And it was purpose designed as an EV, meaning that it was not retrofitted from a current model. It was designed to be an electric vehicle from the get-go. Customer reaction was positive. They loved these cars. However, General Motors believed that it was an unprofitable niche market, and so they collected all the vehicles and crushed them. And this is a picture of, obviously, the graveyard of old EV1s that they have destroyed. I know of a few of them still in existence. I saw one this summer at a conference I was at, and I had to ask them, how in the world did you get that car? And of course, I cannot tell you who or where that vehicle is sitting right now, but there are still a few of them out there, but GM decided that they were not going to sell this vehicle. So why did it take a half a century for us to start seeing electric vehicles come back into the market? Number one is range, right? We still have that issue, but battery chemistry and battery capacity, it just wasn't there 50 years ago. We were talking about lead acid batteries. Lead is very heavy, so it wasn't practical. Gasoline became prevalent, became readily available. An internal combustion engine vehicle was much faster, much lighter, and could be refueled in a hurry. And our interstate highway system, right? We wanted to go further. We wanted to be able to travel a greater distance, and an electric vehicle was just not capable of doing that. And then, of course, the charge time and infrastructure at that time, we look at the EV arena right now, and there's still a lot of areas that don't have proper charging infrastructure. It really wasn't there 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So then we start with a new era, the hybrid vehicle. In January of 2000, Honda introduced the Honda Insight to the United States. This was really the first readily available hybrid vehicle out there, achieving about 49 miles per gallon on the highway and 45 in the city, which was phenomenal for that time. Then, of course, the Toyota Prius. That's the hybrid we all know and love. Well, most people love them. This is actually the Gen 1 Prius, a version that very few people probably remember. They have since made it a slightly better looking vehicle. Fast forward to the current model year, they finally made it a really good looking vehicle, but people didn't buy them for the looks. They bought them for the practicality. So it quickly became the top selling hybrid electric vehicle out there. First generation was about 42 miles per gallon. These things have been in production for 24 years now. This is not new technology. They've been around for quite a while. So that was sort of the genesis of our electric vehicle program was, there's a ton of these vehicles out there and our students were not prepared to work on them, right? They're going to encounter the high voltage circuits and need to know what they can do with them, how to respect them and how to work on them without getting hurt. So why this big push recently to electric vehicles? Fuel prices? Not so much. Think about when fuel hit $4 or $5 a gallon. Did we stop driving? No, we did not. I was driving a diesel at the time. It cost me about $150 a week to fill my gas tank. And started making me really crunch some numbers and figure out, what could I do to eliminate some of that cost? Hence the reason I now drive a Prius. Then there's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They set fuel consumption standards. In the industry, they're known as CAFE rating of the vehicle, corporate average fuel economy. Basically what that means is they're taking the fuel economy of every vehicle that they produce. So from light duty vehicles, right, compact cars, to the big pickup trucks, and they're averaging the fuel economy of all of those vehicles, and they have to hit these targets. So early on, they were relatively achievable, right? 27.5 up until about 2010, and then we increased, incrementally increasing. By next year, we're supposed to be hitting 54.5 miles per gallon. How many of you have a car that gets 54.5 miles per gallon? I don't. I certainly don't. The next set of standards that has been proposed has not been approved quite yet, but the target is 58 miles per gallon by 2032. With current internal combustion engines, that's going to be really tough to do. Now, they can make a car that does that, absolutely. Can they make an entire fleet that does that, right? We have to think about the heavy pickup trucks that are out there and the SUVs. In order to get everybody, the average of all these vehicles across the board, something has to give. We have to find another way. And ultimately, we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases. We're trying to clean up what comes out the tailpipe so that we don't continue to destroy the atmosphere. So the government will issue what they call zero emission vehicle credits. Basically, it's an incentive. If you run a vehicle that is a dedicated alternative fuel or a dual fuel alternative fuel, they will give you credit. And so they incentivize it by using this divisor. So currently there's a bunch of different alternative fuels out there. Denatured alcohol we're familiar with, right? E85, that's 85% alcohol, 15% gasoline. Electricity being a big one. Natural gas, there are some municipalities running natural gas. Hydrogen, that's one that's up and coming. So by running these alternate fuels, they run through, so if you have a vehicle that gets 25 miles per gallon while running on gasoline, and you calculate with this divisor, you can, the CAFE rating for that vehicle now becomes 166 miles per gallon. That's gonna really help your average, right? So you could argue some of it is smoke and mirrors, but it's all about that corporate average fuel economy. A dual fuel vehicle, a lot of people probably driving flex fuel vehicles. So you can run gasoline, you can run E85. Well, they assume that you're running about 50-50. And so they calculate half of your miles at that 166 miles per gallon, and then half of your miles on gasoline at 25 miles per gallon, and you end up with an average of 43. So we're seeing a lot of manufacturers pushing toward dual fuel and toward alternate fuels, electricity, for that reason. Now, as far as efficiencies go of these different technologies, an internal combustion engine is only about 25% efficient. So for a gallon of gasoline that you put into that vehicle, 3/4 of that energy is being vented off as heat, right? Whether it be in the cooling system, whether it be in the braking system, we're losing a lot of that potential energy. Diesel is slightly better, about 10%. And electric is pushing close to 85% efficient. So that's where we start using regenerative braking. Instead of all of our energy from slowing the vehicle down going into heat and being vented to the air, we're capturing it and we're using it to recharge our battery. So it becomes a much more efficient vehicle. When you talk about an electric vehicle being a zero emission vehicle, it's somewhat of a fallacy, right? We're looking at it from the tailpipe standpoint, right? There's nothing coming out of the tailpipe, but that's because there is no tailpipe, right? The tailpipe is miles away. You have to produce that power somewhere. So whether that's a nuclear power plant, whether that's a coal burning plant, the power is being produced somewhere. So we can't fool ourselves and think that this is a zero emission vehicle. It's actually an offset emission vehicle. Now that power plant is under closer regulations, so they're probably running much cleaner than what the average car going down the street is running out of its tailpipe. But let's be real with ourselves. So now we come down to all the different flavors, if you will, right? The various derivatives of EV propulsion. And you see the marketing and you're probably asking yourself, well, what does that mean? Okay, so I'm going to go through one by one and explain what these different technologies are. So we've got our hybrid electric vehicles. They've been around for a long time. So a hybrid basically marries an internal combustion engine. I'm always inclined to say a gasoline engine, but it's not necessarily gasoline. Sometimes it's a diesel engine. So on the heavy side of our industry, city buses the RMTD buses that you see driving around that say hybrid on them. That's a diesel hybrid electric vehicle, right? So you have this internal combustion engine that can either propel the vehicle on its own, or it can turn a generator and contribute to charging the battery, right? The driving range on a hybrid electric vehicle is basically only limited to the capacity of the fuel tank. So if you run out of fuel, obviously you're going to be in sneaker mode and you're going to be finding a gas station. But once you refill that gas tank, you can keep going again. A plug-in electric vehicle, and these are becoming more popular, is kind of giving us the best of both worlds. We have an internal combustion drivetrain, right? So that engine can propel the vehicle, or we have a larger capacity battery on board that will give us a limited range on just electric. So typically they're only in the 20 to 25 mile range, but if you think about your average daily commute, most people would probably be capable of driving to work, sometimes back, on just that electric charge. And so your vehicle would not have to use gasoline. Here, once you run out of that electric capacity, the gasoline engine starts up, it recharges the batteries, and you continue on your way. The internal combustion engine can propel the vehicle on its own through gearing. So that's going to somewhat separate it from the next one. To me, they're both hybrids, but they actually classify them as two different things. So now we have the extended range electric vehicle. What's the difference? Well, the biggest difference is the internal combustion engine at no point propels the vehicle. The internal combustion engine runs a generator, which charges the battery, and then the battery pulls power, or sends power to another motor that moves the vehicle. Is it over-engineered? I don't know, but that's really the difference between the two. You could probably consider them both hybrids, but that internal combustion engine is not physically linked to the wheels. And then of course we have the battery electric vehicle. So that is a 100% electric powertrain. Typically a lithium ion battery and much heavier battery, much larger battery. Most of them are the structural support of the underbody, meaning if you remove the battery out the bottom of that vehicle, you may have trouble opening doors. It's not structurally sound anymore. It becomes part of the unibody, if you will, of the vehicle. Range now is determined by capacity of that battery and battery capacity alone, right? Ambient temperatures will affect it. I'll touch more on that later. And of course, driving conditions. And then we have fuel cell electric vehicles. We don't see a lot of them right now. They're coming. Basically, that is a hydrogen fuel cell that is producing the electricity to power the electric powertrain. So a pressurized hydrogen tank under the vehicle. Everybody probably thinks back to the Hindenburg. It's going to be a much safer tank than that. But 5 to 10,000 PSI pressurized hydrogen running a fuel cell. Refill time on this vehicle is about comparable to what it would be to refill a tank of gas. So we'll get into more of this in a bit, but that can become the challenge. We as a society will have to start prioritizing. Do we want to be able to refill quickly, or maybe we start thinking about how electricity may be a better way to go. So if you're just looking at them side by side, hybrids versus electrics, you're using a combination of electric motors to propel the vehicle in both cases. One has an engine, one doesn't. Battery size, a hybrid is typically going to have a smaller battery because it doesn't necessarily have to be able to move the car on its own. It's a plug-in hybrid, it's slightly bigger than a regular hybrid battery, but not as big as a purely electric vehicle. And then, if you've got a hybrid with an internal combustion engine, you're going to have more maintenance because you still have an internal combustion engine to maintain. You still have to change oil. You'll still have fluids to change, things like that. So maintenance-wise, you're probably looking at a little bit more maintenance on a hybrid. And then, of course, the range. The range on a hybrid is determined by the fuel capacity of the tank. The range of a battery electric is determined by that battery. So now the big question, which of these technologies fits your needs. So you have to start asking yourself some questions. How do you use your vehicle, right? How many miles do you drive per day? Do you have access to a charger? That's a big one. And how often do you take long trips? So how do you use your vehicle? Are you just transporting passengers, right? So if you have to be able to haul cargo, just like when we're buying any other vehicle, we have to consider all these things, or we should be considering these things. I'm more of a practical person, so I'm going to buy a vehicle that fits my needs, not something that just looks cool. So, that's a difference in personalities, I suppose. Do you pull a trailer, right? That could certainly affect, if I buy an F-150 Lightning truck, it's got a range of about 400 miles. If I hook a trailer to that vehicle and try to tow, I'm probably going to cut that capacity or that distance, that range significantly. So again, these are questions you should be asking yourself or should have been asking yourself all along. When you start thinking about how many miles you drive a day, you have to understand that these electric vehicles have a finite range, and that's estimated. I don't want to say it's estimated at best, it's averaged by the engineers. The range is also significantly affected by temperature, ambient temperature, outside air temperature. So I've got kind of a real world scenario. In my field, we use a lot of case studies. That's how we share information amongst each other. So 2019 Chevy Bolt. This is actually an RVC vehicle, part of our electric vehicle program. Taking a trip to Joliet for a conference. This vehicle, when I fully charge it up, has a range of about 195 miles. You can argue whether that's good or that's bad. It is what it is. That's just what the car has. So, I look up the route and it's showing 105 miles to get to my destination. And I drive there, and when I get to Joliet, I have 90 miles remaining on my range. So observation number one, the mileage estimate seems like it's exactly what it should be, right? So I can trust that mileage estimate. Observation two, I don't have enough range to get home. That's a problem, right? I knew it was a problem. I didn't do this just all gung-ho and just decide to drive to Joliet. But it's something you need to consider. So now we're 100 miles from home and thinking, we've got to charge a battery. How do we go about doing that? And this really was the first trip I had taken with one of these vehicles other than short trips around town. So I did it as much for research for the program as anything. If I'm going to teach people about electric cars, I better have lived the life of an electric car driver. So just decide, okay, let's do it. So challenge number one, find a charging station. It's harder than you think. So how do you find anything nowadays? Duh, Google, right? So we Googled it, and here's what Google showed us. They showed us about 6, 7, I think some of them on the right side are stacked on top of each other, charging stations. So we drove to the 3 listed charging stations. The first one was a ChargePoint charger, was inside a Kia dealership. I don't have access to that, right? That's for their cars. Okay, let's try the second one. Now we're just in a different flavor. We're in a Volkswagen dealership. Still not helpful at all. Third one was an Electrify America outside of a Walmart. At least now we're outside. We have access to it. So now challenge number 2, I've never charged an electric vehicle. How do I go about doing that? So, they take my credit card, no problem. One issue I did have, because I work for Rock Valley, is I didn't get a receipt, right? That's a problem when you're on a business trip and you're not getting a receipt. But took a picture and our accounting department was happy. So here's what it looks like. You drive up to Walmart and you'll see this big group of kiosks outside in the parking lot. And you can plug in various types of electric vehicles and they will happily take your credit card. The issue then becomes, looking at this, 50 minutes left until 80%. What am I going to do for the next hour? Shop at Walmart, I guess, right? Honestly, this was a well-implemented plan on Walmart's part because they have a captive audience now, right? They know you can't go anywhere. And so what better place to put a charging station than outside a store, right? So actually, as we start thinking about how we're going to make an EV fit into our lives, these are actually places to start considering. If you can put a charging station outside of a restaurant where you're going to be sitting for an hour, you're not going to care if you're there for an hour. Or if you're going to go inside Walmart and do some shopping, right? You're not going to be bothered by the fact that you're there for an hour. We were traveling and I had really no reason to go into Walmart, but I did out of boredom because I'm just going to sit there for an hour otherwise. But I've got friends who drive Teslas and they'll sit and watch Netflix for an hour while they charge. It becomes almost second nature, part of your normal routine. But it's something you definitely need to consider if you're thinking about one of these vehicles. So we got to 80%. You might ask, why didn't it fill it all the way up? Well, this is what we call a DC fast charger. A DC fast charger is going to dump all kinds of energy into this in a hurry. The problem is, as these batteries get closer to full capacity, they have to go into a balancing. And we can't do that at high speed, at high current. So we have to slow the charge way down. So when we publicly charge at a DC fast charger, we're typically only going to get 80% and then it's going to shut us down. So 80%, got us most of about 3/4 of capacity. Cost us about $12. So again, this is what the dashboard looks like. Did not take me back to 195 miles because I'm only at 80%. So it gave me 161 miles of range. I've got plenty to come home, so that's not an issue. So we start looking at what that $12 actually got us. If we take the 160 miles that we charged to, we subtract the 90 miles of range we had remaining, we have 71 miles that we have actually recharged into this vehicle for about $12. Now, Electrify America is charging us about 48 cents per kilowatt hour. Out of curiosity, last night actually, went into my ComEd bill. I said, I wonder how this compares to my electric bill. ComEd is charging me 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So if I was to do this charge at home, it would have cost me $3.98. So there's a premium for the convenience of being able to charge wherever you want, but that's part of the equation when you're trying to figure out if this is a practical vehicle for you or not. For comparison, I just want to take it to one step further here. My Prius averages about 40 miles per gallon, okay? 75 miles, I would have used 1 3/4 gallons of gas, would have cost me about $6. So cheaper than if I had to charge publicly, but still more expensive than if I could run on electricity out of my own home. Something to consider. Granted, I have to buy the vehicle and install the charger and all those things. When we came home, it was colder and it was windy. When we got back to the college, we had 39 miles remaining. So we lost approximately 25% of the capacity of this battery driving the exact same route in reverse. The biggest difference was 35 degrees and we had to turn the heat on. So something to be aware of in an electric car, the heat is generated by the battery. So if you're gonna warm up the cabin, you're gonna deplete some of that energy that would normally have gone to range. So I've had a few close calls with college vehicles wondering if I was gonna make it back to campus or not because on the display it showed when you parked it last night, it showed you had 50 miles. And then you come out the next morning and the temperature has dropped 30, 40 degrees and now your range is down to 20, 25 miles. So something to think about. That heat is going to deplete the battery. Or the battery has to warm itself up to function. These batteries like to operate in about the same temperatures we do, right? So the battery needs to be 70 to 80 degrees. And if it's not that temperature, it will warm itself up by using some of the capacity of the battery. So we come back to those other questions. How many miles do I drive each day? Do I have access to an EV charger? So the charger is probably the single most important one. Is there a public charging station near you? I'm not aware of very many in Rockford at all. I know Woodman's has some Tesla chargers. Cherryvale Mall has some Tesla chargers, but those are two completely different things. I cannot plug a Chevy Bolt into a Tesla charger. They're different connectors, different protocols. They're not compatible yet. And that is where Elon Musk has poised himself to make lots of money, right? They are now sending adapters and allowing manufacturers to utilize their connector. So now Tesla may become as much of a power distribution company as it is an automaker, which was really proactive and genius on his part. But for today, I cannot charge at that Tesla station. I've been driving to work and I'm watching the dashboard and it's showing me 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. And I get to a point where that range says 0 and I'm still miles away from campus and I'm passing gas stations right and left and they don't do me any good whatsoever. I'm gonna be in sneaker mode in a hurry. I'm gonna be phoning a friend, something to try and get myself to work. So you gotta plan ahead really with your charging. Level 1, so they break up the chargers into multiple levels. A level 1 charger is one that can plug into a standard outlet, right? A 110 outlet, 120 outlet at your home. The problem is the time involved in charging with this method. This is out of the Nissan Leaf owner's manual. If you read up at the top, 50 hours to charge this car when it's completely depleted. Think about that. How often do you have 50 hours to let your car sit? Over a weekend, cool, right? If I gotta go to work the next day, I might have a problem. So to me, if you're gonna own one of these vehicles, you better plan on putting what we call a level 2 charger in or paying to charge it somewhere else. So a level 2 is much faster, but you have to be able to install it. To be practical, I would say install one at your house. It's going to require a 50 amp, 240 volt outlet, likely outside your house or in your garage. This is what you would run a welder off of. I mean, this is a large outlet. This is the charger that we have at the school. So that gives you an idea what the plug looks like. So again, do you have access to that or not? And what kind of long trips are you taking? What are your daily needs for a vehicle? How far do you drive each day to commute to work and back? For most people, when we ask, would an electric vehicle suit your daily needs? I think if we were honest with ourselves, most of us could answer yes. I drive 40 miles round trip each day. I could absolutely do that in an electric car. I have done it frequently in an electric car and had plenty of range. Can you handle range anxiety? That is a very real thing, right? When you're staring at the dashboard, think back to the first time you ran out of gas in your car. And don't deny it. Don't lie to yourselves and say, oh, it's never happened. Yeah, every one of us has run out of gas at some point. It's a sinking feeling, right? But most of us just have to figure out, okay, where's the closest gas station? You might have to hike there, you might have to borrow a gas can, but you can get moving again. With an electric car, that's not the case. You're getting towed somewhere. So you have to be able to deal with the range anxiety portion of it, and it's very real. I have experienced it, and it's highly overrated. How often do you take long trips, right? If you're willing Or are you willing to add some charging time? You know, the Chevy Bolt, I can go 195 miles and I'm gonna have to stop and recharge. And if I plan my route accordingly, that's probably not a problem. But I have to figure out what am I gonna do for the hour it takes me to charge while I'm there. You know, if you can work that into your travel plans, that's fine. But not everybody can, not everybody is willing to, I guess would be, you know, this almost becomes a question of, is our society willing to slow down? Because that's kind of what's going to need to happen for this to really take hold, or battery capacities are going to have to, the capacity is going to have to increase dramatically to make this more practical. Would you be willing to rent a car for a longer trip or borrow a car? So that's an option too. You know, there's ride sharing, there's vehicle, or you can swap vehicles, things like that. Could you loan somebody your electric car while you take your long trip? These are all things you kind of need to factor in before you go and take that plunge and buy an electric vehicle.